Welcome to Intertek's Natural Disaster Series. I'm Shawn Donovan, and I'm excited to bring you Intertek's new series on discussions on natural disasters related to testing, certification, codes, and much more. Today, we're going to be discussing tornadoes. And our subject matter expert today is Andy Holstein, manager with the Middleton Evaluation Services, part of Intertek's Building and Construction Division. So Andy, thanks so much for joining us today. For those out there who don't know who you are, can you share with everyone a little background on yourself and your current role with Intertek?
Yeah, I'm a licensed PE in the state of Wisconsin, and I hold a PhD in engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've been with Intertek for 8 years now, initially managing a lab that tested, amongst other things, windstorm components and shelters. And most recently, I've moved into the evaluation services group for the last 4 years, where I'm now currently managing. This work allows me to do a lot of certification and building code compliance work for storm shelters and their components. Heavily involved in the industry, and most recently I've been serving on the committee for the 2023 version of ICC 500.
Okay, well, that's a great lead because today we're going to kind of focus on that as it's related to design and construction for storm shelters and more specifically tornadoes, right? And I find this topic kind of interesting. Ironically, yesterday, tornadoes came through. I'm in Tampa, Florida, and there's tornadoes sighted, hit some areas around here, Pinellas County, which is kind of Clearwater Beach and that. And they had pictures in the news of like the roofs torn off, and we're used to hurricanes down here, so it was kind of interesting the timing of this and catching the news this morning with the tornado warnings and tornadoes that actually went through Florida. So I guess this is bigger than just a Midwest thing with tornadoes when we talk about tornadoes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Tornadoes are a really huge aspect of natural disasters that we see in the U.S. and a lot of them aren't necessarily giant EF5s that you see on the news, that take out entire communities. There's so many more lower scale EF0, EF2 tornadoes that come through all the time in a lot of different areas that we still need to prepare for and still need to have, a safe refuge from.
So let's dive into the ICC 500. Can you kind of, for the audience, can you kind of provide kind of a brief or high level overview of what the ICC 500 is intended for and really what it covers?
Yeah, so it's a design standard that governs storm shelters, specifically for hurricanes, for tornadoes, or a combination shelter that would be able to do both a hurricane and a tornado. It involves required design loads, as well as different components and features that need to be in every single shelter, as well as how to test them. So that, is one area that Intertek really comes into, is the testing of these things. And ICC 500 tells us how to do that. It's been around since 2008. It's been revised a number of times in 2014, 2020, and now most recently in 2023. We're currently wrapping up that section. And it's broken down roughly into either community shelters or residential shelters that are made for 16 or fewer people on the smaller scale.
Well, that's what I was going to kind of ask, because our minds down here in Florida are around hurricane, and all the construction for homes and buildings have to meet certain standards. But for this, we're talking about shelters specifically, right? Not necessarily just general homes or multifamily buildings or things like that.
Yep. Yeah, we're talking specifically about either, you could have a prefabricated residential shelter that you can put in your garage, in your basement, out in your backyard. Otherwise, the other end of it is, some of these large community shelters that are either for the community in general, where public comes to, or you can talk about these going into schools and large office buildings, fire stations, things like that.
So when we're talking about the ICC 500, what are some of the most important design considerations when it does come to these tornado shelters?
Yeah, that's it's really hard to say one or a couple even most important design considerations. One thing that we do on the committee is really try to balance the requirements that we're putting in there to make sure that they're absolutely critical for the safety and the operation of that shelter, in order to ensure that we're balancing life safety, which is incredibly important, obviously, but also economic viability, so that people can afford to put in these shelters and that we're not taken away needlessly from something else. I think one important aspect is definitely for a designer to understand, these components that they're using in these designs, how they interact with each other, and all the very specific requirements that come down to that particular component. This isn't necessarily go down to your local big box store and find a door and then find a doorknob and things like that. These are all incredibly specific. And a particular door assembly, if you change the size or if you change the hardware component or if you put something on that door that wasn't intended to be there, it will often violate the actual compliance with ICC 500, and it could unfortunately lead to harming the occupants of these shelters that we're trying to protect.
And I would assume, again, we're talking about all elements of the building envelope, correct? It's not just the roof or not just doors and windows, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so many different aspects of that, from, as you said, the roof and the walls, the ventilation system, sanitation, things for larger, community shelters, fire safety, as well as, opening protectives, which I think tends to be
right.
Something that a lot more people think about is, that the windows and the doors are going to keep out the wind and the debris, but there's so much more that goes on.
Since you've been involved in this for a while, what are some of the common mistakes that you've seen, that architects or designers or even building owners may make in this space?
Yeah, I think, like any design process, right? There's going to be mistakes. There's going to be a learning curve. There's going to be a whole, plethora of things to consider. And anytime that you have something this complex, it just compounds how many different mistakes that you can make. And I think that the number one thing that I've seen is not understanding the individual components, what's actually being required of them in their use, what's being required of the surrounding items to interact with those, individual components. How does the wall interact with the roof? How does the window interact with the wall? Things like that. And I think that combined with taking liberties, perhaps, beyond what a particular component was intended to do when we tested it and certified it, can lead to some issues and some unforeseen circumstances.
Well, and I'm assuming it's safe to say that this is where they would typically hire Intertek and bring you in to kind of help with that process, because there probably is so many complexities to what all's involved. Is that kind of where you guys are brought into the mix?
Yeah, so Intertek can serve a number of different functions, here for the design and certification and engineering of these shelters and their components. Obviously we have a national network of labs that are able to conduct this testing, which is very, very specific and complex testing in some cases. In some ways it's easy, but in some ways it's pretty complex to get a 15-pound 2x4 moving 100 miles an hour exactly where you want it every single time.
Right.
And so beyond the testing that I think a lot of people immediately think of for Intertek with shelters, we have engineering services that can go through and make sure that the larger shelter itself, the walls, the roofs, the windows and doors included, are all designed to meet the wind and the rain loading and soil loads for underground shelters, things like that, that need to be done by a licensed professional engineer. And we have a wonderful team of engineers that can assist with that. And then the one of the final ones would be that our evaluation services and our certification team can assist with actual component manufacturers and or manufacturers of prefabricated storm shelters themselves. We can help guide them through this process, which can be pretty complex, and ensure that they're taking the right steps, that they understand the process from start to finish before they're getting into it, to ensure that we end up with the the certification and the outcomes that they're looking for, and that we're able to help them put a reliable and dependable product into the field that that homeowners or children in schools or whoever can depend on with their lives.
So are your clients then, so you mentioned building product manufacturers, which makes sense on the product side of things. Do you also work with architects and building owners, and who really your customers when it comes to these type of services?
Yeah, predominantly from a certification standpoint, our main customers would be the manufacturers of the door, the window, the prefabricated storm shelter, things like that, of the actual, standalone storm shelters themselves and their components. As far as the design of these very complex, large, community shelters, that's a world all unto itself, as far as very specialized engineers and architects out there that do day in, day out, and they work with schools, they work with fire stations and community organizations to develop these shelters and consider all of the aspects that go into them.
So jumping back into kind of these tornado shelters, what have you experienced or seen as some of the common, misconceptions regarding these shelters?
Yeah, there's unfortunately, the ICC 500 standard itself, it's not a short document, but it's certainly not as long as one of the codes or something like that out there. But there seem to be a lot of misconceptions that have built up over the years. One of them is about certification. ICC 500 has actually been pretty clear for several cycles now that anything that they refer to as an impact protective system, so that's a door, a window, a louver, anything like that, needs to be certified by an agency such as Intertek, and it needs to be certified by an agency that performs ongoing periodic inspection of that production. Having a test report is one thing, right, that says at this exact day and time, this product performed in such a manner. But certification takes you that extra step and says, for the next 15 years, the next 20 years, every single door, window, louver, any, component that is being produced by this company is going to perform the same way that we evaluated that first original one, on day one. And that's the huge difference there is having that certification that grants you the reliability and the trust in that product. And so there's a misconception out there that some people think, I have a test report, that's all I need, I can go to market. And that really isn't entirely true, and it hasn't been true for a while.
So Andy, how can architects and building owners balance the cost of a tornado shelter with the needs to provide adequate protection, for its occupants?
Yeah, it's absolutely a critical aspect of design. And it's something that, we as the developers and committee for ICC 500 keep in mind every time that we are looking at this standard, because in the example of a school, for instance, where you're putting in a shelter to protect students, every dollar that goes into that shelter is a dollar that's not going towards textbooks, it's not going towards teachers, student services, it's not going towards the new gymnasium, or something like that. So it's critical that you do balance these things. And I think one of the best ways to balance this is to start from day one and say, there's going to have to be a shelter in this structure. We know that it's required by code, or the building owner has said that they need this, and incorporate that into the design from day one, so that you don't get to the end of the project and say, okay, I now need to take this square peg of a storm shelter and fit it into my round hole of a building. Either you're trying to shoehorn it in somewhere that it doesn't fit, or you realize that you've only got, a relatively small occupant load for a shelter, but you're having to harden the entire gymnasium because nothing else will work. And that's where you end up being forced into an inefficient solution based on, trying to come at the issue a little bit too late in the game.
So Andy, when I was growing up in Chicago, we used to have tornado drills in grade school, and we'd go to the middle of the building and get down and put our hands over our heads and put them to our knees. That was our tornado drills way back when. Not sure if they still do that or not, but
yeah, I won't tell you how long ago it was that I was in elementary school doing that as well, but yeah, they were still doing it at that point. And that's brings up something that's called a best area of refuge, or best available refuge area, I should say. Something where an engineer or an architect, looks at an existing building and says, we're not able to put in a shelter, but we think that this hallway is the best shot that you're going to have in order to refuge from a storm event. And obviously it has benefits and it has weaknesses. Those areas aren't necessarily designed to go through an entire storm event, but at the same time, it's important to identify what we think is going to be the best option if you don't have the ability to get into a fully certified storm shelter.
All right, so it is still kind of a thing then.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And you may have touched on this a little bit, but when architects and building owners today with existing buildings, I mean, their new construction is one thing, right? But with existing buildings, when they're brought in to harden a facility of some sort, I mean, is that a thing? I mean, do you see that in the work that you do with existing structures and trying to prepare it to meet these standards out there?
Yeah, so it's obviously a lot easier, as you said, to do it from day one, to put it into, a brand new building where you're able to control as many aspects as possible, or use it in an addition to an existing building. But it is possible to harden, so to speak, a section of an existing building and bring that up to compliance with ICC 500. It certainly is not nearly as easy of a road, though. You have to ensure, your walls, your roof, your floor, everything is designed to meet those loads. And then if you are looking at the doors and the windows and the openings, you need to make sure that your ventilation system is going to meet the requirements. As I said before, you can't necessarily just take the entry door of your existing building and put an extra deadbolt on it and have that be sufficient. These are items that a lot of times they're anchored very, very stiffly and strongly into the surrounding substrate, so it's not necessarily just a pull something out and put it back in sort of thing. But I mean, it certainly is possible, and once again, it might be the option that's economically viable to give a best possible area to refuge during one of these storms, even if it's not able to bring itself all the way up to full compliance with some of the storm shelter requirements.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is it's certainly possible, but it's a lot more challenging than new construction. Sounds like, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we get into, kind of the nitty gritty of the ICC a little bit, the ICC 500, what are some of the maintenance or inspections or approval requirements for tornado shutters or shelters? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So there's requirements in ICC 500 for all aspects of things. So from the approval side, as I mentioned earlier, anything that's a door, a window, a louver, anything that's going to protect an opening in a shelter has to be certified. And so that has obviously approval requirements there. There's also, during the construction phase, there's going to be special inspections that are conducted on the site while the shelter is being constructed for some of these larger community shelters. Larger community shelters also require a peer review process where the registered design professional that's designing the shelter will actually have an independent engineer or registered design professional come in, review their design, and make sure that they're catching all of these, minor or sometimes not minor issues that may have been overlooked in the original design, to ensure that best design possible is going into the actual field. And then maintenance is also absolutely, critical. A lot of these shelters, for instance, I go back to a school situation, that shelter isn't going to be a shelter every single day of the year. It's going to be a library. It's going to be a classroom. It's going to be a hallway. And students are going to be opening and closing these doors potentially dozens or 100 times a day for 15, 20 years. And yet at the end of that 20 years and hundreds of thousands of cycles, that door needs to engage the first time, and it needs to engage correctly. And so maintenance of these components is absolutely huge. And that's why ICC 500 has dedicated sections to the maintenance of these structures to make sure that they're ready to go for their entire useful life.
So Andy, what advice would you give to architects or consultants, building product manufacturers and owners to help them in the design and build more tornado resistant buildings?
I think the biggest piece of advice I can say for the larger shelter is start with the design early, bring together all the stakeholders, the owner, the construction, as many stakeholders as you can, and get that process integrated as early as possible so that all of these different aspects of the shelter can be considered throughout the entire design process in an integrated way that's going to be as efficient as possible and it's going to be as effective as possible.
Well, Andy, this has been really great information. I know there's a lot there and we probably just scratched the surface. Is there anything that I didn't ask you or that we talked about that you think might be valuable for our listeners to know?
Yeah, I think, one of the most important things is just, it is a very in-depth topic. There's a lot there. There's a lot to go through. can be confusing. And I would just say that we're here. We've got a lot of resources that are available to people out there that are looking for it. We've got a previous webinar that was done specifically on ICC 500 at a much greater level of depth, as well as what services Intertek can provide there. As we touched on today, we can help from day zero to essentially installation of that product, between our testing, our engineering services, our certification and evaluation services, potentially field services in the actual construction process itself. There are so many different ways that Intertek can assist. And I think just not being afraid to reach out and contact us and let us know how it is that we can assist people with the issues that they're having, or just general questions that they have.
So Andy, if somebody wants to get in contact with you, how can they reach you?
Yeah, the simplest method would be email. So my email address is just my name, andrew.holstein@intertek.com. And they can also give me a call. My direct line number is area code 608-824-7429. Otherwise, Intertek has dedicated web pages that go into a lot of this information and has ways to contact us through that. One of them is intertek.com/building/storm-shelters. We'll get you into some of this information, and then we'll be able to reach out and get in contact with people.
That's great. And this is actually one of two parts. Our next discussion is going to be on ASE 722, which is an integral part of all of this as well. And we have Joe Reed with Intertek for that. And it really works, my understanding, kind of hand in hand with the ICC 500. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. So the 22 version of ASC 7, which is for all the loads and designs for building code compliance, has now added an entire chapter just dedicated to tornado design for wind and debris impact. And so that's it's something new that hasn't been there before. It's incorporated into the newest version ICC 500 here, and it's going to bring a lot of changes, but a lot of opportunities for improvement as well. And Joe is going to be able to touch on that.
Well, Andy, thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it. And that concludes this discussion on tornadoes, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks a lot.